feel like I should do a little bit of this because we are hanging with some OGs today. First of all, Michelle Duster, OG descendant. I'll just say that, my friend. I'm so excited to see you. And let's also recognize Ida B. Wells as a flippin' OG. And I mean, check out these books that are right behind you. I'm excited they're back there. So I think everyone knows you're an educator, you're also a historian, and you're an activist. You're also an author, not only like this active author who writes fun articles every month, but then you've got these two books behind you. So the one with the pink and the red, Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells, and the larger one with kind of the blue-gray sky behind her. You have Ida B. Wells, The Voice of Truth, and this is all about your paternal great-grandmother. So amazing. And so I'm super excited. I know there are many people who have been hanging on, waiting to chat with you. I know we had to reschedule from a couple of months ago, although I think super exciting that it's landing on this week. So welcome, everyone. Happy CultureCast and happy darn Friday and summer solstice. And I'd like to welcome my dear new friend, Michelle Duster. Hello, how are you?
Hey, Marisa, I'm great.
Oh my gosh, where are you? Where can we find you today? What time zone and where are you?
I am in Central Time Zone in Chicago.
Oh, same with
And it's hot
well,
in Chicago today.
you know what? I think it's hot everywhere. I've been seeing every morning, whether it's the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, my news that pops up, it's like how to stay cool in the heat, which is interesting. So it is hot everywhere, including Nashville, although the sun is a little clouded today during summer solstice. But I'm super excited. Not only are we meeting today, but it's also Juneteenth week. It's theoretically Independence Day, right, for African Americans. And I think I actually want to jump into that because you just recently posted an article a couple days ago, and it's all around Juneteenth. And so, what I'd love to is actually start with that. I think I was mentioning to you backstage that every year I've had the chance to, when I've worked inside a large company, have had the chance to convene people and actually bring other folks, much like you and I are talking right now, onto a virtual call, if not live, and actually not only celebrate Juneteenth, but have someone help educate people. And I have to believe, I know that I am still in that learning journey, and I know others are. So I'd love for you to talk about the significance of Independence Day, but then what specifically you covered in your article. And then we'll go from there.
All right. Well, I think there are quite a few people who are still in the learning stages of Juneteenth. I'm fortunate because I basically grew up knowing about it because my mother is from Texas.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so Juneteenth started in Texas, in Galveston, in 1865 on June 19th. And that's where Juneteenth comes from, sort of pushing those two words together. And it commemorates the day that the enslaved people in Galveston were freed. And I mean, the myth used to be that the enslaved people were informed that they were free, but it's actually the enslavers who were forced to enforce.
Oh, wow.
So so there was this General Granger who went to Galveston to enforce the fact that slavery had actually ended in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. So 2.5 years later, in June of 1865,
Okay.
is when this group of people that were in Galveston were able to become freed. And as a result, they decided to celebrate their freedom. And so it started very small in Galveston, and it started spreading over the state of Texas. And then people migrated from Texas, like my family,
Wow.
who migrated. There were quite a few of our family members who migrated from Texas to other places in the West, like specifically Colorado. And so Juneteenth has been sort of a bigger thing in the Denver area. They grew up knowing about it, and now now that it's become nationalized, it's now becoming more well known across the country.
That's amazing. And so, again, I'm on my learning journey. When this happened in Galveston in Texas, 2.5 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation, was that the last kind of population that was informed, or was it the first? So,
No, it was the last.
Was it the last? Okay.
Yeah. And the thing about the Emancipation Proclamation that is an interesting twist is that it did not end slavery. It ended slavery only in the Confederate States.
Yeah.
And so the slavery that was taking place in the states that were not Confederate they still had slavery until 1865. The December of 1865 is when slavery was absolutely abolished.
Amazing. I love that the enslavers were actually ordered to declare that to those who have been enslaved. And that, therefore, is why Independence Day. I love that. And I also love the story of migration and how you knew about it because, your mother's from Texas, but then the families and population that have moved on to Denver and why that's such a huge recognition and celebration. And now a national holiday, which has been now, I think this is year 3 officially, right? A national holiday. Right.
Right. It became a national holiday in 2021.
Yeah, 2021.
Under Biden's administration.
So, I mean, I know there's a lot to cover since 1865, and I think people can read your article. They can go, we'll make sure we have your website information posted on the show notes. But have we come a long way is my question. When you think about independence for African Americans in the United States, but then I know a favorite topic of mine and a passion of mine is really equity. And I think you also identify, all right, well, we've come a long way, but then what is the pathway to finding equity? Because I think you've been able to talk about, all right, here's what contributions that your culture has made. Here's access to certain rights, like the right to vote, the right to become educated, the right to purchase property. I mean, that's like you've outlined that since then. But then I think there's still some inequities that I think you've identified. And I also recognize, right? So one thing is, I'd say all of their African Americans' equity, like farmland that they have owned, I think you point that out, of something like $326 billion worth of actually farmland that actually really does belong to families that are out there that are not reclaimed. And then I think you also talk about just less disposable income in many of the social and service areas. So say more about that. Like, what are your thoughts and what did you write about?
So what I wrote about in my article about Juneteenth, which I focused on the concept of economic freedom.
Yeah.
Because, Juneteenth is also in some circles called Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Emancipation Day. And so people focus on the concept of freedom as far as physical freedom. But I started thinking about, okay, so yeah, I mean, obviously it's wonderful to be physically free. But then once you have that freedom to move about in society in a post-segregated world, do you have the financial means to actually enjoy the experience in this country? You might have the legal right to go into a hotel, but can you afford to rent to stay in the hotel? You can go into a restaurant, but can you afford to enjoy a meal there? And so there's still barriers based on money and based on economic strata that are not necessarily racially based, but because of the oppression that has been a part of our country since its inception, since the first enslaved people were brought here against their will in 1619.
Mhm.
For this 400 plus years, there has not been equality in really any place. But then when it comes to, like I said, we enslaved people were freed in 1865, which was about 160 years ago. And out of that 160 years, we had 100 years of segregation. So
Yeah,
we really only had 60 years of attempts to, have any level of equity. And 60 years is a very short amount of time to
agreed.
catch up from a 400-year start that some other people had. And so we still have a long way to go when it comes to accumulating wealth and having opportunities that are equal to people who had a 340-year start.
I love that you put it in that context in terms of oppression and timeline. And if you look in the context of really 60 years in the face of 340 years, help people do the math around that. Clearly, if there's more time to settle in, so to speak, and gain opportunity, it is 6 times, right? Almost 6 times where we are now 60 years later. And I'll say, just my reaction listening to you, look, I've been in this path of being a people and culture leader, for almost 30 years, in corporate America, and over the last year and a half, helping corporate America on the side with a lot of startups. And even in almost 30 years, I think about the term equity as it relates to racial equity, gender parity, et cetera. And I still think there are days when I go, wow, have we come a long way? And then there are days where I'm like, wow, how are we almost exactly the same place? When I think in the context of access to development opportunities, right? Or access to uh, not only development opportunities, certain roles and jobs, which to me equals a pathway to economic freedom. And I still don't see that, and I know there are a lot of companies that are out there really making their way, committing to equity. It's not only just diversity, but it's inclusion and creating access to equity. But I hear you when you say 60 days in society. Maybe I'm being impatient. 30 years inside the workplace, and I feel like we're still moving at a very slow pace. And I say that because, again, you look at the percentage of women versus men leaders running Fortune 1000 companies, right? You look at the percentage of people of color running Fortune 1000 companies, and that's the context that I'm coming from. And so it makes you wonder, okay, is it going to take another 100 and 280 years to catch up? I just wonder. I hope not.
Well, one of the things that I also mentioned in my article is the reality that when Black people have built their own, this whole concept of like, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, right?
Yeah.
That's the American mantra. And Black people have done that. And only to have the communities, the self-contained communities that were built in Tulsa, Oklahoma is one example of many examples that were sort of their own, city within a city kind of thing.
Yeah.
Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was destroyed. And the people who had their property destroyed have never been compensated. There was no insurance policies that covered their losses. And so, you're dealing with an unequal opportunity situation to begin with.
Yeah.
And then when you build your own, and then it's destroyed, then you're coming back with zero. And that has been the situation in too many examples of the wealth that we have built has been destroyed. With no retribution, no, if you want to call it reparations, and no kind of economic recognition for that loss. And so that's where we have come. That has been our experience as a people.
Yeah.
And so you're constantly starting over again from zero. And so if you think about it like that, it's been even sort of less than 60 years or less than 100 years, because I can't help but think about, what if Greenwood, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had not been destroyed? How much generational wealth would
Yes.
have been passed down in this last 100 years? And Elaine, Arkansas, and we can just go down the line of different communities around the country, Rosewood, that were just destroyed with nobody was ever tried with any crime. Nobody was ever
Yeah.
compensated for their loss. So um, it's not, this whole concept of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps doesn't apply to us when we have done it and our property has been damaged.
Yeah. I think that's how you add up all of the equity that I think African Americans in post segregation world, how they've lost that. And I think that's a great education for people who also are listening in. And it's funny you were talking about that. I think people are barely learning about this now. I mean, there's new projects out there. Funny enough, I think after you and I spent time together in Washington, D.C., I came across, I don't know if you know these leaders, there's a group of women who are called the Descendants Project, right? So they're called the Descendants Project,
Mhm.
and they are out there helping families, communities go and reclaim land, property, that belongs to the families and communities based on this, not only in the last 60 years, but then, going as far back as, you know, pre-segregation, post-emancipation proclamation. So I don't know if you've come across them at all, but I think that's one drop in a bucket of people who are trying to help educate and also help people claim what's theirs. I don't know if you've seen that at all.
I've heard of them. But one thing I really hope that people start to recognize is that there are systems, there are political and structural systems in the United States that have created this inequity. It's not about individual people
Yeah.
being hardworking. It is structures. For instance, if redlining that happened when it comes to housing and um, restrictive covenants that where the banking industry was involved in creating barriers for African Americans to buy property. Historically and still to this day, if somebody wants to start a business, a lot of times the loans they might get are at higher interest rates. I mean, there's just all of these barriers and all of these realities that just make it so much harder for African Americans to succeed and thrive. And so, when people say, well, get off your lazy butt and just work harder, it's like, well, how are you supposed to do that if all of the structures in the country, the scaffolding of this country creates these barriers that are separate and different
Yeah.
than other people?
Yeah. I think that's a whole other topic in itself that we can go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I hear you. And I think it's systemic to some extent, to the extent that any of us as citizens of this land of the United States have control. Yeah. Part of it is, use your voice, go out there and vote. But then I also don't want to go down that rabbit hole either of like how much of that is going to change, right? Until I think beyond, and there's this great study that I read about, and it's by Gallup, and I think it applies to the corporate world. Government and, I'll just say government at large isn't the body to change things. I think businesses, especially large businesses, and I'll just start here within the United States, I think they have the power to make change just economically for people, across this fine land. And again, systemically, once you begin recognizing what you're creating inside your companies, but then how do you then band together and think about, I just think about the banking system, let's start there, right? And how can you help people of color, Black owners get access to small business loans at equitable rates, for example, like I think it starts with not only government and use your voice and use your vote, but then I think for those of you who are sitting in corporations and are also um, warriors, champions for equity and inclusion, it is about how do we treat people, and then how do we take that power and influence what's happening around us with other companies and the systems that we're a part of. So yeah, I could go down that rabbit hole, but I won't. I also, I want to talk about these amazing books that you wrote. We started off, first of all, how I got to know you was really because we had this amazing gathering of all of the descendants of US Black civil rights leaders that happened back in February on the 13th and 14th, and we were at the White House. Amazing. And, Michelle, and I know that this was the first time that this collective of families have come together, although I think there have been connections along the way. I think it's just the first kind of convening of people. And, Ida B. Wells, and I think about the first article that you sent to me, and I love this too. Like, I love how there was at least a representation, and a very prolific one, I would say, just the representation of Ida B. Wells inside the U.S. Capitol. And of course, when we were at the African American Museum of, History and Culture, that was amazing too. But we met back then, and I'd love for you to talk about your experience, because you wrote about it, but then you also wrote about it through the lens of, these pioneers for the U.S. being represented, these women pioneers, including the OG Ida B. Wells, in the U.S. Capitol. So talk about that, the article that you wrote, but then I think your reflection on, now that it's been a few months, the visit that we had in Washington, D.C.
Right. Well, it was an amazing experience to meet other descendants of civil rights activists that are in the history books, and they're sort of almost household names to a lot of people. And I mean, I knew I was not the only descendant of somebody who is a historical figure, but I had never really met a whole group. I mean, I've met, like you said, a few individual people. So it was really amazing to be in the same space for several days with people who have a similar kind of experience, life experience. It is a very unusual experience to be a direct descendant of somebody that is revered, and people shiro and all kinds of ways that people connect with who Ida is. And so to meet other people who have that same kind of, experience when people meet them, it is a very unusual kind of life experience. So we had that in common, to begin with. And then the other thing that was really interesting is that a lot of our ancestors knew each other. So there was that kind of bond, like Frederick Douglass was one of Ida B. Wells's mentors. And so for the descendant of Frederick Douglass and I to be in the same space, it's like, whoa, our ancestors knew each other, and now we're meeting each other, and we're kind of doing similar work. And so, just to be able to share that was amazing. And then when it came to again, the kind of unusual life experience of having your ancestors in museums, in museum exhibits, represented in public spaces, that's a different kind of experience. The women who were represented in the Capitol were Mary McLeod Bethune and Rosa Parks. So Ida B. Wells is in the museum.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
She's in the Smithsonian, the African American Smithsonian Museum. Fairly, she's quite well represented in that museum, as well as so many of the other ancestors of the descendants who were in that group. So it was
That's right.
It was a lot of fun, just to share that that space, and to share the experience of being in those spaces together, and having the opportunity to kind of share and compare and contrast our life experiences. Quite a few of us are working in the communications field, or some kind of in our own way, being activists. So we do have that in common.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, yeah, you're reminding me when you wrote that article, and I remember this tour guide saying this, that in the US Capitol, only of 540 rooms, only two were named after women. And then, of course, I think less than 5% of there's over 250 statues in there and busts are in the image of women. And then, yes, you pointed out that actually Rosa Parks and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune are the two African American women that are represented in the US Capitol. And that's wild. Again, I think about our history and what our history has been built on. And, I know this is trite to say it, but behind every great man is a great woman. And quite frankly, behind every great woman is a great man. Okay. So the fact that, again, that representation just shows how we've started as a country. Now I'm just going to be ringing in my ears the 60 years versus the 340 years that we've been talking about. But yeah, I'm now reflecting too on it was amazing and such a privilege and an honor to be in that space. And right, hearing the conversations about different families, ancestors, knowing each other, and not just knowing each other, but having that relationship. And I even think, what was the story as it relates to Rosa Parks and Ida B. Wells, right? So wasn't there a connection? I mean, there's so many connections that were happening there that I thought this is just amazing to see everyone come together. And to your point, there's a commonality too with what everyone is doing. I think you're right, the theme of being in communications, but everyone in their own way has become an activist, not only to honor their legacy, but their family's legacy, but to create their own. Like when I met you, I'd love to talk about the work that you've done in Chicago, right? You talked about having the first street Chicago being named after a woman and a housing community after Ida B. Wells. Talk about that. Like, how is that coming to play in your communities as an activist? I know you write about it, but then there's a lot of physical stuff that you've been doing too that represents this.
Yes, I mean, I started. Well, I've always been a writer. I started my career as a writer in advertising. And I get asked all the time if I decided I wanted to be a writer to follow in my great grandmother's footsteps, and that is a no. In fact, I really tried to not do that because I knew I would have never-ending comparisons to her.
Yeah.
And I wanted to forge my own career and my own identity. So I was purposeful about not being a journalist, but I couldn't help myself. But I've always been attracted to sort of storytelling and narrative creation because I felt it kind of started when I was in high school. I was on the newspaper, but then when I got to college, there were some things that I experienced that really had an impact, a long-term impact on me, that made me feel that the media is so powerful in shaping people's ideas about what reality is. And 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 when people go to certain kinds of schools and get certain kinds of education and then go on to work in certain kinds of professions, they end up making policy and other decisions that affect other people's lives. And sometimes they don't know very much about the people whose lives they're impacting,
Yeah.
because it's everything is from a theoretical standpoint instead of actually knowing the community or knowing the people that they're impacting. And so I felt that the information that people are receiving about the people that they might ultimately go on to make decisions about, if they end up in politics or they end up in as business leaders and, making all these decisions, I started feeling it was very important for them to have a more truthful information about people that they don't know. And so it just made me realize the power of the media. And so I wanted to be involved in shaping those narratives that I felt were very skewed negatively when it came to the African American experience. And so I was asked questions about, or people made assumptions about who I was or where I came from or what I was about
Hmm.
based on the fact that they saw a movie or that they saw, a TV show or they saw the news. And so I'm like, this is a problem. And so I really wanted to do that. And I started in advertising. And as I've gone on my journey, I've just kind of expanded out to not selling products, but being more involved in shaping and creating work in public spaces that's educating
Yeah.
versus selling. And even though I guess you're kind of selling information, but
Yeah. Right.
not a product. And so that has become very important to me because it affects my life. When I walk into certain rooms or certain spaces or certain situations, and I can tell that people automatically are making assumptions about me, and I'm like, they're making those assumptions because they're consuming this media that is perpetuating, stereotypes or falsehoods.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, what can I do as one person to counter that and show a bigger, broader, more diverse story of who African Americans are, and specifically women, but all marginalized people, because I think most of the stories are very one-dimensional, and we are
Yeah.
multi-dimensional people.
Oh my gosh, all of that is so profound. And you decided that in high school. Is
I
that, I mean, based on all the media and how media was influencing
It was,
people
yeah,
and
it was really in college
okay.
where I encountered people who had never been to Chicago, they never met anybody like me.
Wow.
And they never met anybody who was from the south side of Chicago, went to public schools,
Yeah.
like what my whole background is. And so some people were asking me questions, and I was like, why are you asking me that question? Like, are there two parents in your household? Or,
Oh
well,
wow.
I know you, and who's in a gang? How many people in your family are in jail? I mean, just these kind of, I'm like,
OMG.
yeah, I'm like, really? Why are you like, why do you think that would be my reality just because I'm Black and from Chicago?
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah,
I thought I heard that in high school, and then I think how that continues on through college. I hear you. I think that's amazing. Like, who is Michelle? The fact that that kind of shaped your need to want to communicate. I get that you started in advertising, but then it is about, and I know that someone made a comment, a Weiss made a comment about having information is key. It's about helping people understand the facts. And I feel you. For a bit, how do you help society? How do you help corporations understand that? It's still somewhat the same. I think about like growing up. Now, I grew up in East LA, and then we moved to the suburbs called Upland in Southern California. And in LA, there were more people because we lived in the community where there were people of color. But then when we moved, we didn't. And it was for education. And I remember people will always say, and I'm sure you got this too, it sounds like you did, like, oh, where are you from? And I would say, oh, I moved here from LA. They're like, no, originally, where are you from? And making an assumption that because of the color of my skin, because potentially I had an accent, apparently I did back then, who knows, that they just made assumptions based on, and I love this, you're connecting the dots for me, what is being shown in the media. And I grew up when MTV became a thing, and what was represented on MTV was pretty homogeneous, like pretty generic. And if there was any diversity, it was pretty much a caricature or a stereotype. So to your point, I love that that was a connection you made that got you into advertising and communication. And I know we're on a culture cast and everything that we are talking about is culture, but I'd love to get like your perspective and definition of, from your lens, how would you define culture? Like, what is it for folks who are listening?
that's a great
Yeah.
question. To me, culture is ways that people reflect who they are. And it can be in multiple ways. Obviously, it could be through fashion, food, everything. I mean,
Yeah.
architecture, just every aspect of a reflection of who you are as a people.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think I find a theme with every culture cast guest that I have had on here. And I think it starts with, people think culture is a thing that you create this environment around you, which it is that too, right? You think about how do you cultivate environments where people can thrive? That is culture, but it starts with you. And it's like very personal, right? As a human being, how you self express, what you identify with, the people, the norms, the upbringings, but then how you put that on others. I think also is culture. When I hear you say that, not only is it first as an individual and then as a people. So
Well, and then the thing is that, I mean, sort of getting back to stereotypes a little bit, this idea that there's, I mean, obviously there's, I guess, a Black community, but there's no one Black experience.
yes,
And so, for instance, I think families have cultures, right?
yes,
Within families, you might, your family might be sort of quiet and, whatever. And then somebody else's family is loud and boisterous. And so, in those particular families, they have sort of different cultures, different ways of doing things. So, it's all very diverse and sort of unique. And I don't think there's one way to kind of define what any one culture is.
yeah, I agree. I think it's again, I think it's personal, and you're right. It's like a rainbow. I'll say that. And I know it's Pride Month. Happy Pride Month, by the way. But it is, it's very individual and everyone has different experiences. And you can't just make assumptions just based on what you think you know from the outside. I love that. I think about too, as we have had the chance to talk about Juneteenth and dig a little bit into history to create clarity, as I know I'm on my learning journey and others are as well. If you were to provide advice to someone on how they can be an individual and impact positivity and impact culture around them, from your perspective, what advice would you give people? So, leaders, individuals who are listening, just all the themes that you're talking about, what advice would you give to help people create thriving environments for others?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is to be willing to learn, because I
Yeah.
think the some of the misunderstandings that happen in between individual people or within societies, or if you want to say different cultures,
Yeah.
is the lack of understanding. And so sometimes people go into spaces and they are imposing their own ideas or their own realities onto something that it's not um, in alignment, with what they're entering. And so I think sometimes people really just need to humble themselves and be quiet and actually listen, instead of thinking that they know everything.
Yeah.
And I think that most people do enjoy being listened to. And so that builds a sense of trust, and and then you can sort of go from there where people feel like they are being respected, and then you can kind of build a level of camaraderie versus you're sort of a people can view somebody as sort of being an invader,
Yeah.
or a colonizer, or somebody who's just coming in and taking over versus actually being collaborative.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you start with they need to be willing to learn to start with. But then I love this part too. It is human nature. If we just break it down, like if be willing that having the willingness to learn is being open, like going in, not just leading with your perspective and assuming, but
Mhm.
actually being open to seeing things that and acknowledging that you've never seen this before. You use the word humble, right? Humility. And that having that humility to be open enough to just say, I don't know it all, nor do I care to know it all. Meaning, like, be open to what's around you. And then once you do that, also be willing to listen. I hear you on that too. Um, I think about, this basic human need that people want to be seen and heard for who they are, period. I love that advice that you would give that to help people create culture. All right. So I want to talk about, what are you working on now? I know we've talked a lot about your writing, and I know there's a few projects that you're working on right now too, as you create your own legacy. What are you up to these days, Michelle?
I feel like I'm so always so busy, and I keep thinking as soon as I finish this, then I'm going to relax.
Yeah.
But in the past, I mean, in the past few years, I've worked on quite a few public history projects, including and the Light of Truth, Ida B. Wells National Monument, which was created by Richard Hunt in Chicago on 37th and Langley. I
Nice.
was involved in having Ida B. Wells Drive renamed from Congress Parkway. It is the first and still only major street downtown Chicago that is named after any woman or any person of color. It was the first. And I've been involved in some historical markers in Chicago, in Memphis, consulting on a Barbie doll.
Wait, what?
Yeah, there was an Ida B. Wells. Did you see it? It was an Ida B. Wells Barbie doll.
No, I did not see
Yeah, here
that.
we go, the Barbie.
What? That
Yeah.
is amazing. Oh
Um,
my goodness. That's so cool.
yeah, so that came out in 2022. And then there's a quarter, an Ida B. Wells quarter that's coming out in 2025. So I've been consulting with the U.S. Mint along with my brother Dan, and I worked with the U.S. Mint on that. So that's coming up in 2025.
Ooh.
And then I have, so what I'm working on now is a suffrage. Oh yeah, I worked on 3 suffrage murals here in Chicago to recognize the women that paved the way for us to have the right to vote. And that's very significant because when I say we, I worked with a committee. We created a mural that has 10 different Chicago-based suffragists. It's huge. It's 7 stories high,
Oh,
this mural.
where can we
And
find that?
it's at, you're going to love the address, 33 East Ida B. Wells Drive.
Oh, that's awesome. Actually, there's a large cohort of people that I know that are in Chicago right now for the next couple of days for the Society for Human Resources Management National Conference. So if we direct everyone during their free time to, first of all, go to the first and only street named after a woman in Chicago and person of color, but it's 33 East Ida B. Wells Drive.
Yes, and actually it's on Google Maps too. So if people
Oh,
just type in Google Maps, Chicago mural, suffrage mural, then it's on there. And then there are 2 other ones at 623 South Wabash, which is like half a block away.
okay.
So I worked on those 3, and now I'm working on one in New York City. We're still looking to finalize a location for the mural, but we're going to have a mural created with over a dozen New York-based suffragists. I'm working on another large-scale mural in Chicago to honor Richard Hunt, who's the one who created the monument of Ida. And then I'm working on a committee to have a monument, a national monument, suffrage monument in Washington, D.C. on the Mall.
Oh my goodness.
That is a huge project that will take multiple millions of dollars in multiple years. But once it's done, I'm going to just say it will get done. It will be the only monument on the Mall in Washington, D.C. that is dedicated to women.
Oh my goodness, we need to. I'm sure you probably already have this all in play as this comes to life. Like, that will be a huge unveil and huge celebration. So hopefully when that all comes to play and actually is physically there, oh my gosh, I would love to be in the audience to see that happen. That's amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah, well, we deserve it. I mean, women, can you believe it's 2024 and there's not one monument on the mall in Washington, D.C. that recognizes and celebrates women?
Right? Yeah, I'm loving all of this, that you're bringing this up, because I think when we were initially going to talk, we were going to celebrate both Women's Heritage Month and Black History Month together. And I agree with you. Like, it's about flipping time. I think that's amazing. And what a legacy that you're creating. And, I also think about, I didn't realize the Ida B. Wells Barbie was in 2022. That was kind of a harbinger for the Barbie movie coming out last year and what that represents, right? I mean, really, that's super cool. And then I thought too that you had also, there's another book that you shared with me when we saw each other about different civil rights leaders coming to life, and it's through the eyes of a young boy. And
Yeah.
I thought that also is a project that you're potentially thinking of animating.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's a process. I've been trying for 10 years
Oh my gosh. Okay.
to get that book animated, and it's definitely not an easy thing to get done. So we'll see. But I'm working on a sequel of that book. In that book, Tate, the character Tate, is in fourth grade, and he meets and interacts with 28 different historical figures. So he learns about them from them. Like
Yeah,
he's a time travel kind of book. And the sequel, he'll be in sixth grade.
that's
And
great.
yeah, and he's going on a road trip where he's learning things from some of the sites that he sees. So it's still fantastical because he's going to be talking to inanimate objects and everything.
Yeah.
But we just it's a fun way for kids to learn history in a more interactive, sort of imaginative way. So that's just a lot of fun,
Yeah. Well, I
to
love
apply,
that.
yeah, to apply factual information in a fictional way.
Yeah. And I love that too, that it is coming through the eyes of a fourth grader and now soon to be sixth
Yeah,
grader.
he's grown up.
Yeah, he's growing up, but also to engage young people. And you think about education. I think education's freedom, right? And I think about like having access to that earlier for children who don't know. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, well, one of my dreams is, I mean, to get these books into as many school systems as possible, or even after school programs, because kids really do love this book.
Yeah.
And it's just because it's such a different way for them to sort of enter this world. And they're learning about these people, by being, it's almost like they become the character and they're traveling in these spaces with him. So if there are any educators out there or superintendents of schools,
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, we'll connect you with one of the leaders. I don't know if you had the chance to meet him I know that he had some of his organization there when we were in Washington, D.C. at, all the different venues where we were, but he was also at the dinner. Remember we had dinner with RFK Center for Human Rights, the
Mhm.
leaders and the board members. He was there. And I think there's a way, Artist Stevens, if you're listening, or if your team is on watching right now, he's the CEO of the Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and also having access to them can also help you get access to the public education system. So let's note that as a follow up.
Yes,
That'd be
absolutely.
great. Well, I think I always love to ask these questions as we wrap up. I love talking about all things culture, including pop culture. And I know we've kind of given you a heads up that I was going to ask you this. So these days, in the world of Michelle Duster, what are things that you are loving? Whether it's like food, what you're reading, what you're watching, what you're wearing. I mean, what are you fancying these days?
Wow, that's a good question. Um, I think right now I'm just kind of getting into music, just like relaxing kind of music. I really love Spanish guitar,
Oh,
and
yeah.
actually I've started getting out a little bit more and seeing some live performances in some plays. So I'm enjoying that. After living through our pandemic where we weren't doing so much of that, and
Yeah.
so now I'm kind of getting back out there and seeing more live performances, so that's fun.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you said Spanish guitar. I
I
know
love
this is old school Spanish guitar, but like Gypsy Kings. And if you've listened to them at all, like it's very energizing and relaxing at the same time to listen to that kind of music. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, live performances and getting out there. I agree. Get out there. Well, how can people reach you? What's the best way to reach you? We will capture this in the show notes as well. And where can they also find all your books?
Well, my website is mldwrites, WRITES.com, that has links to all of my
Oh, great.
articles and information about the books and the projects that I'm working on. You can find me on Twitter and, well, I'm always going to call it Twitter. I don't care.
Yeah,
Um,
X. Yeah.
you can find me there and on Instagram at Michelle Duster, just my name, and then Facebook at MLD Writes. So just remember MLD Writes and Michelle Duster, and you can find me in any of those spaces, and LinkedIn and Michelle Duster.
Oh, great. Perfect. Michelle Duster, MLD Writes. We'll be able to find you and also to get access to everything that you've written, whether it's the books and or the articles that you've been writing. That would be amazing. And look, I just want to say thank you, Michelle. I know we've talked a lot about Ida B. Wells and what she's represented, but I want to thank you for what you're representing. I love your championship for women, period, and representation of people. I love that. I know a lot about, of course, your family's history and, of course, honoring all of that, but everything you're doing to create a voice for women and like leadership, which I think is amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, my dream is for, kids that are born right now, this minute, to grow up thinking it's normal to
Right?
see, to see women represented in public spaces when they're just navigating the world, and they see images of women on the walls. They see statues of women. They see movies that have strong female characters. I mean, they just need to see that. Boys and girls need to see that. So that's my hope, that I'm making a difference so that kids can see themselves.
Amazing. Well, thank you for making a difference and actually bringing a bright spot to summer solstice today. This has been all amazing. And thank you so much for spending time, Michelle. And to everybody, we will see you in a few weeks for the next CultureCast. And until then, stay tuned to the show notes so you can get a hold of Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Happy Darn Friday and have a great weekend.